anytime I engage with someone, I ask that. And I started asking that question. I didn't really have a reason for it. But usually when I get someone answering that question, I start to hear what they really would like to do in life.
Right.
And a lot of times my challenge to them is, why do you need $10 million to do that? Very few people, and I said this before, have given an answer that requires $10 million.
On this episode of TLC Connections, GT Freeman sits down with Dr. John Wilson, entrepreneur, professor at Drexel University, and creator of the Entreprofessor. John shares the story behind his $10 million question and how it reshaped his career, from corporate leadership to teaching and mentoring the next generation of entrepreneurs. Together, GT and John explore what it means to rethink work, how AI is changing entrepreneurship and education, and why anyone can take the first step towards building something of their own. We hope you enjoy the episode.
John, welcome.
GT, it's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me.
We've been I've been wanting you here for a long time. I'm glad we were able to finally figure it out on the calendar. So, John, I want to start with this. You are an entrepreneur. You've started your own company. You teach entrepreneurship at Drexel. And you're also a content creator, and you have a YouTube channel titled The Entreprofessor. So I see a running theme here.
You don't say.
Yeah. Why don't you dig a little bit deeper on that? I guess my first question is, what drew you to this path of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think it started, I remember exactly the day that it started. It was in December of 2007. I spent the early part of my career in sales. I worked for a technology company, software company. I sold what I like to call the world's most boring software. It was tax software for big companies. Yeah. But at times I was pretty good at it. And this particular year, I didn't just have the best sales year for me, but I had the best sales year that anyone had in the company. And I can only take so much credit for that. The company itself, of course, was doing really well and positioned well. And there were a lot of things that were happening. But that was a year when things were starting to get a little dicey. Companies were getting very uneasy. And, yet I still just kind of threw the hustle and the grit. And I would just say like the buildup of a couple years worth of work merging with a theme. And so I was having this really good year. I walk into the company holiday party, and the owner of the company, the current CEO of the company, walks up to me. And the company at this point's got 500 or 600 employees. It's not a small company. And he acknowledges that I was having a great year and congratulated me and said, listen, if there's anything you ever need, let me know. And in that moment, for whatever reason, it was like, wow, here's somebody that could write me a massive check. And I thought, well, here's somebody who could write me a check for $10 million. And what would I do differently with my life? Or what would I do if I had $10 million in the bank? And I remember there was just this split second, immediate thought that I had where I would help people to think very unconventionally about their life, about their work, and about the things that they were wanting to accomplish. And my thinking was, how do I even do that? Well, I need to get a PhD, and when entrepreneurial leadership was the area I was interested in. I wanted to write books. I wanted to coach. I wanted to create media content and all these things. And so I had this moment, this epiphany in that moment of what I wanted to see. And that was the $10 million question was born that day, but it set me on a path that over the next about 10 years, I was able to position myself to actually go in that direction and do it without radically interrupting all the other stakeholders in my life.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned December 2007. The first thing I think of is, the very next month you're in 2008.
Yes.
Yeah. How did that impact what you did immediately, like in 08 and 09?
Yeah. So the first thing I thought was, well, do I really need $10 million to do what I want to do? And the answer was categorically not. In fact, I have asked the $10 million question now to thousands of people in the time since then. Actually coming up on, can you believe it's coming up on, 20 years here that I've been asking this question. And so, one of the things I find is rarely does anybody say something they need $10 million to achieve.
Right.
So the first thing that had come to mind is I'd like to get my PhD in entrepreneurial leadership. And so I started looking at programs and I started thinking about like, how would I do this? My boss and mentor at the time, her name was Penny Vennerholm, was one of the kind of people that just poured life into everyone around her. And she's like, well, it may be a little bit tricky to convince the company to pay for a sales rep to get a PhD, but let's figure it out.
Well, particularly in 2008, 2009, was your company you worked for, did they experience the consequences, I guess, of the crash, the financial crash and the real estate crash in '08?
Yes and no. One of the things that was really interesting, this company was more like companies are today, but even back then, where it was not just an application that did something over and over and over again. It needed tax research content, so it had to be changed all the time.
Right.
And so it was a service as much. So the revenue that 80% of the company's revenue was secure from day one.
Got it.
Every year, because it was this annuity, because it had to be up to date.
Doesn't matter how the economy is doing, you have to file your taxes, right?
Exactly. Death and taxes, right?
Right.
And so that being the case, it was never a situation where the company was at risk of going under. Like a lot of software companies, there was a 6 or 8 month period of time where every company just said, let's just stop even looking at software and let's just muddle along. Whereas this, this annuity, and of course now it's called software as a service. A lot of companies have this type of model where it's just this continuous fee for access, but it was still somewhat unusual at that point. And so the company didn't have the same maybe stability questions,
right?
But the ability to leverage a resource that was there to me. I didn't need someone to write me a $10 million check to go get my PhD.
Right.
I literally found a PhD program that was possible to do remotely, and that I could do it. And then it was just a matter of showing the company how it was going to bring value to the organization. And sure enough, as I started working on my PhD and working my way through it, I started moving to leadership roles in the company, sales management and director of sales, and then moved into more general management roles and senior roles in the company. So it was a little bit of a journey. What was interesting was it kind of fueled the career path I was on, but later it also created the space for me to kind of make a very different, take a very different path in life.
So you mentioned Penny. Did I get that name correct?
Yes.
So she was a mentor. As you think about the path you took up to your doctoral studies, are there any other particular individuals that come to mind as like kind of helping shape that journey?
Yeah. So, I think the two people, and I've already kind of inferred one, the CEO of the company, his name was Jeff Westfall, was somebody that has been and continues to be a friends for life, as he likes to say, and has been, someone who, really just helped me look at the world through different lenses, because he, is very innovative in the way that he looked at things. And I don't want to just pass by. Penny was such an impact in my life, an influence on my life, because of the way that she led. If anything, and you're quite aware of, the kind of studies that I went through in organizational leadership, there was this whole method called transformational leadership. Yeah. And I don't know that I would understand even to this day, to the depths I do, what transformational leadership is if I hadn't experienced Penny, because that's who she was. She was a transformational leader. She, as I like to say, she led one person at a time. Yeah. And she had that, and the fancy word for that's idealized influence. Right. But she would adapt to each person. She was very empathetic. She was always, listening. She was always really seeking to understand, lots of curiosity about who someone was, what made them tick, what drove them. And, she was always mindful of what her role was, what her job was to do, what the company needed, but she was very, very intentional about leading each person in the way that they really needed to be led to really become their best self, or to really step into their truest potential.
Thank you for sharing that. So those are two influential people kind of more recently. Go back in time a little bit. Maybe, I don't know, your younger years, elementary school, middle school, high school. Like when did you first get like the bug for like entrepreneurship?
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, I think it was when I was 4 years old. My mother introduced me to what I consider to be one of the greatest entrepreneurial leaders of all time. And this is, kind of pulling from my background as a growing up in a family that were Christian, that kind of went to a Christian church, and she introduced me to the story of this guy named Nehemiah, and it was and she was doing she had some friends that she met with, and they would study this Bible story. She said, "Hey, do you want to like do a little skit and work with them and everything, and kind of demonstrate what the story's about?" And Nehemiah was a hospitality manager, essentially. He was someone who was leading a large organization, worked for the king of Persia, and he got disturbing news that the city where he originally was born was destroyed and in ruins, and he'd never actually been there, but it was like somewhere where he felt a connection to. And so he spent an enormous amount of time building a plan and preparing and ultimately going to the king and saying, let me rebuild this area. Kind of recognizing the political environment had changed. There was a kind of an intention of putting people back in their locations and with their religious beliefs and everything. And so he got permission to go and do this and ultimately became the governor of the region for 70 years. And what I loved about it was just such a great story of, well, I consider it a great entrepreneurial leadership story because he went in and there was, literally nothing but destruction. And he, really implemented restoration and really kind of moved things ahead and was such a great leader where he was almost bookish. And yet he clearly had the ability to inspire volunteers to really get engaged, to really do their part and to organize them in a way that they had tremendous impact. And so I would say that would be the first. And I think implicit in that, certainly my mom, who was a journalist, I always said she had the art and science of conversational journalism to a T. And she really, kind of gave me a lot of that curiosity and that interest, and that story would be an example.
You probably had no idea at the age of 4, and she probably didn't either, that you would eventually write a book on that topic, right?
Right. Yeah. It's a year ago, it was published and wrote a book called The Nehemiah Way, and it was really just focuses on that story of what here you have a writing that's 2,500 years old, providing really some of the most impactful leadership, just skills and example. And they often call him the administrator in biblical literature. And so someone that kept immaculate details, like very, very like specific details about all these different things. And you saw how he, identified champions. He divided work into manageable chunks. He even, before that, even just focused the work and didn't try to boil the ocean or do, more than was possible or feasible. And then, getting really clear on resourcing and how to get the right people in the right place at the right time. This is 2,500 years before Jim Collins' Good to Great, and yet you see this great example of it.
Right. Well, that's a great story too. Was that your first book? Or did you have one?
It was not. I wrote one before with was someone who was my executive coach when I was in industry, and then became a business partner and friend, Dr. Tom Tavares. Dr. Tom and I wrote a book together called Hardwired to be a Great Leader. Okay. And we kind of brought together, he had written a book called Hardwired, and he, is a behavioral psychologist, and a lot of what he did was help people really understand their true personality and the things that they were really natural strengths to them, and not in a kind of like, cookie cutter, strengths finders or Enneagram or Myers-Briggs, it was a much more kind of complex way to assess that. And then of course I was Great Leader was one of the kind of models that I had been writing about at the time. And so we kind of brought our two ideas together to be hardwired to be a great leader. And I've done some really interesting things, worked with very, very large, one of the largest accounting firms and their leadership team. We've worked with a lot of other, both commercial and nonprofit organizations, just helping to do that kind of leadership development. Okay.
Well, you mentioned in December 2007, you had this this $10 million question kind of pivotal moment. And you rattled off some things: PhD, coach, books, entrepreneur, professor. So we talked about the books. Yeah. Let's talk about either the entrepreneur or the professor. So
it's pretty hard to separate those. I am the entrepreneur after all. Yeah. I think to get into that, even just to say, how did I even get here? Here I am today. I teach at, one of the largest, most, really most impactful universities in the world, in my kind of biased opinion. Yeah. And I'm also, an entrepreneur by nature. I've been part of 2 tech startups now. I've started a couple of my own companies. I have a whole coaching initiative that I'm working on right now. And so there was a shift that happened, and it didn't happen overnight. I had the $10 million questions. The first thing was go get a PhD. Well, that was a 5-year proposition. And so, as you know, that's not a short short project or a small project. Right. And so, there was 5 years that I was really looking at that. I started in 2009 and finished in 2014. Interestingly enough, 2015, the year after, is when I took my sabbatical. The company I worked for had a sabbatical at 15 years, which was a real blessing.
What was the purpose of the sabbatical? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was the one thing that was really unconventional about it. It wasn't like a sabbatical in education, like you know
Right.
now, where it's to do a bigger project or different kind of work that would be hard to do while you have other responsibilities. It was meant to be a break.
Okay.
And so you know, I wasn't checking my email every day. I wasn't, you know, it was literally the first time I ever really spent intensive amounts of time with my family. We were experiencing something new together.
Right.
We were you know, just there was no like there weren't any distractions. There weren't like friends coming by. There weren't like events to go to. It was like we got to really choose what we were doing every day. And you know, in a lot of ways, this was an interesting bookend to the moment in 2007 when I had this epiphany. Like I could live like I had $10 million in the bank.
Yeah.
One of the things I would have said is I would travel with my family. And so this is like, we were doing that. I didn't have $10 million. We'd spent several years saving up for this trip. And, you know, to have this where it's like every day we get to decide what is it that we're going to do today? Like, what are we going to experience? What are we going to learn? We had chosen specific books to read. I mean, I lugged 15 books. It was right before the year before we got a Kindle. But we were, you know, reading about the Alhambra, which is like the, you know, one of the oldest buildings in Spain. Or we went to the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and we got to experience art and chaos and, you know, just construction and all these things like, you know, coming together in one place, which was so interesting. Or, you know, San Sebastian, which is like the most beautiful beaches you can imagine, and then the food was like nothing we'd ever seen. And so it was just this time to really just experience kind of all of the world and things that you kind of miss along the way. And I think it really started to bring back to like what really is important in life.
In addition to obviously to travel and experiencing these new things with your family, was it a time for any like alone time, self-reflection? Because I know at some point you decided to leave the software company and go to Drexel and start your own company and get into social media and all of that. So did that happen on that trip or did that happen later?
It didn't happen in that trip, but what did happen in that trip is I started to really rethink what work was about.
Okay.
And this is where I was effectively a corporate entrepreneur for most of my career. Even though I was in sales, then I was in leadership, I was in what they call product management. I was leading product management, and then I was general manager. And really the thing that all the way through was it was innovating. Some of it was innovating. It's like new customers to go after, new products to develop, new problems to address, new just approaches to the way the organization was run. And so I was really experiencing all these entrepreneurial things.
When you say corporate entrepreneurship, is that what you refer to as entrepreneurship? Or is that different?
They're different, but let's say they're two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
I would say I was a corporate entrepreneur in the sense that I was formally looking at things that were, you know, opportunities and then kind of building business cases for let's go and try this and let's experiment until we find something that works. Entrepreneurship, though, is actually the person.
Got it.
So corporate entrepreneurship, I always like to say is corporate entrepreneurship is a structure. And companies that do this well create like innovation labs or some kind of space. You know, Google and Amazon and companies like that create space for their employees to innovate. So that's a little bit more of a structured approach. Whereas entrepreneurship is it's that proactive mindset. It's that innovative mindset. It's that ability to look at problems in different ways and to, you know, experiment with what are different ways we might approach this and what are ways that we can do this. And so I think I always had an entrepreneurial mindset,
right?
But I also had the opportunity to participate in more of an entrepreneurial way in a company that traditionally wasn't very entrepreneurial. And I think that's really why my career was able to progress during that time.
Well, you said you were starting to think about like the redefinition of like work, like go a little bit deeper on that. What do you mean by that?
If you think about anyone you've ever seen that was great at what they did, is it because they perfectly matched the job description that they had in front of them?
Yeah.
It's probably not. It's probably the things they did in addition to that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, certainly the core job, or what I used to call it the core 80, you have to do that well. You have to do it, you know, you have to meet the responsibilities, obligations of the job. But entrepreneurship is the domain of that other 20%. When you take that bold 20, that step out and say, what in my core job doing this well, what are the opportunities that we're missing? What are the gaps? What are the kind of just shortcomings of the approach? These are all kind of these adjacencies are all the domain of the bold 20, where if you kind of step out into that adjacency and address it with a perspective of curiosity and an entrepreneurial mindset, you can create things that no one else would have thought of because you're closer to it than anybody else. And you're also in a position to do it. And it also just, it propels you forward into something that the job never intended, but it's like the job and the organization are better because of it.
Yeah. I'm going to stay here on this idea of rethinking work. So I lost my father a few years ago, and I heard you just say that you mentioned you lost your father, as well as your mother, as well as your mentor, Penny. It seems like that all happened within the same time frame.
Yeah, my father passed away 2 weeks before Penny did, so that was a tough year.
So I know in my own personal journey, when that happened, I started to like rethink work as well. So I wonder how much of just the natural process of like aging, as you get older, you start to think about things like that.
Yeah.
Especially as you lose, loved ones and people in your circle. Did that play any role in it, or you were going on this journey regardless?
Yeah, I was going on the journey regardless. I mean, I was already on the journey, I think.
Yeah.
My mom passed away in 2012. And so I was actually, it was interesting. I would have finished my PhD that year, but I needed to take a pause. I had finished the coursework. I had started my dissertation, but I really took about 9 or 10 months and just kind of put everything on pause. I just needed to reflect a little bit. But in 2007, I had this epiphany moment and I started on this path. And I remember when I signed up to do a PhD, I was like, this is going to cost me something. And it's not about the tuition. I was actually very blessed that my employer covered a lot of the tuition. But I knew it was going to cost in terms of, time with family, events, other things that I would have been doing in that time, just leisure, recreation, that kind of thing. Right. And so I had set a lot of those things aside. And one of them was, I just remember, thinking at the time when my mom passed away, is like, she didn't get to see me graduate.
Right.
And it was kind of something she was really excited about, that I'd gone on this path. And, just it reminded me like how short our time really is.
Yeah.
A little bit of context. So I'm pretty young to have lost both my parents. You might be thinking that at this point. The missing piece in that is my parents were in their 40s when they had me.
Oh.
So my parents were both, my mom was well into her 80s. My dad was into his 90s. So they
lived a long life.
They lived a long life. In fact, both were blessed with health until really the very end. My dad was only really a few days, and my mom, it was a few months. But so that's part of it is like, I think sometimes people are like, oh, wow, you lost your parents already. And it's like, well, that was like a known quantity for me, like growing up, was my siblings were going to get to experience them to the tune of 20 years more than I would. Yeah. And so I think if nothing else, when my mom passed away, I think that's when I started to really, I wasn't like ready to make a major leap or change anything, but it started me on a path to really rethink, like, it's a short movie. I was, my father was, I was almost 46 when my dad died. He was 46 when I was born. So I'm like, wow, I've seen the second half of this movie.
Right.
And it's a short film.
Yeah.
And so, you start to really think about like every year counts. Each week we have 168 hours. We don't get any of them back. And so, are we doing the thing that matters most? And if the trajectory is just work as hard as you can, make as much money as you can, try to retire a little early and then go and do the things you want to do. It's like, well, that's a lot of life to pass before you start doing the thing that you want to do. Yeah. And I think that was going back to that trip to Spain with my family. I think that was the moment where it's like, most people don't do anything like this until they hit 65. And then they're running out of like energy, health, time, all those things. And so, really hit me how critical it is to be, in the space that you're intended to be, even if it means that you're maybe passing on the top dollar in terms of your earning potential and those kinds of things.
So you're in Spain. You mostly your travel, experiencing, this great quality time with your family, doing some self-reflection. You're already well on your journey. Tell us how you got to Drexel and what you're doing for Drexel.
Yeah. So the last couple of years, I was in industry. It was an older company. It's been around for decades, but the time came where it made sense for the company to go public. And so I was, part of a group of people that supported the efforts. There were some that were really like full throttle, full time, working on getting the company ready. But I was helping with, just supporting those efforts. And in the summer of 2020, so we have 2020 happens. I've now, I've lost my mentor It's like the kind of the company started to change, and we're getting the company ready to go public. And anyone who's ever told you ever talked to about going from an entrepreneurial kind of family type business, it was like the annual revenue I think of the company was like under $50 million when I first started there. I was like one of the first couple hundred employees, and by the time I left, it got a $3 billion valuation when I went public. Wow. It was like 1,500 employees. So so much had changed, and of course Wall Street, they bring in. Right. The ones that are, that all know how to make it look great to the public. So, and so I was navigating a lot of that. And at that point, I'd made the connection there was kind of an executive program with Drexel where some of us came in, the CEO and myself and a couple others came in and helped to teach some classes in the business school. Okay. And I reconnected with a professor that had been my professor in my MBA program 20 years earlier. Wow. And so we started having coffee, and then eventually.
So your MBA was Drexel also?
My MBA was actually Penn State. So,
okay.
Penn State MBA.
So this is a former professor at Penn State.
Who had then moved to Drexel. She had gotten her PhD at Drexel. Okay. And she invited me, she introduced me to the dean, and they invited me to start teaching entrepreneurial leadership. Yeah. And so that was, that was really my background in my PhD work and everything that I'd done there. I started teaching this course on leading startups and leading new ventures, and entrepreneurship was a big part of that program because corporate entrepreneurship was a big part of it. And so, I was in that space and I did that for a couple of years. I also was adjuncting at a couple other universities at the time. But that summer, it was like in July, we took the company public, middle of the pandemic. Right. We're all like figuring out how to use Microsoft Teams and Zoom and try to collaborate remotely. And we get the company ready to go public. I didn't get to go like into Manhattan for the big day, but I was on the screen. I literally have a picture of myself. I was like 60 feet tall, okay. Kind of clapping. They had us all, the day before we had to clap for 90 seconds in front of a camera. That was really weird. And so I have this picture of me like on the front of the NASDAQ building as the company went public. Okay. I was adjuncting, and as I like to say, the dean that summer made me an offer I probably should have refused. Oh, that's funny. But I'm so glad I didn't. It was always my plan, like 5 or 10 years later than that, to just to kind of retire a little early, so to speak, and to teach. And I had entrepreneurial things that I wanted to do, and I think all of it came together in that moment. Is so, what am I waiting for? Right. And how many, more decades will, I wait until, and then maybe it's like I'm out of decades. And so, a lot of stakeholder building with,
going back to Carpe Diem there.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. A little bit. And, it was a lot of stakeholder building with my wife and, and a lot of looking at what the logistics are and, and stepping into a little bit of uncertainty. I'm like, how am I gonna get 3 kids through college if I'm not, making the kind of money that I was? And, thinking, well, maybe they can go to Drexel and, and seeing how that, it doesn't always work like you expect. But, so, there was definitely some uncertainty with it, but in building that stakeholdership, ultimately though, it was like I had, for 10 years, I had been moving in this direction. Right. And so it was like the leap was not as daunting as it might have seemed. And I'd been advising a tech startup. It was a cybersecurity startup at the time. And there was really a need at that point for me to be operationally involved. Right. And so, I had some pretty candid conversations with, the dean about like what I was and wasn't trying to do. I said, I'm not trying to like start a career in like, become like the world's best academic, or I'm not trying to go get into, university politics and leadership and those kinds of things. I'm like, I want to inspire entrepreneurs to launch, grow, and thrive. Right. And so, students is, was an area I was thinking, what if somebody had stepped into my path in my 20s and helped me to kind of see, it doesn't have to be like show up every work and do what you're told. Right. That there is like a way to create things and to change the world around you and to like to have an impact. Yeah. Without like, not being able to support yourself, And
how long you been teaching now for this entrepreneurship?
I just had the 5 year. I just literally just got the 5 year.
All right, so 5 years. So 5 years ago,
yeah,
I don't think anybody knew what ChatGPT was. Well, maybe they did. I don't know. Not yet. AI certainly been around since the 1950s, and
OpenAI was around at that point. Yeah, ChatGPT hadn't been conceived yet.
So my question is, how has teaching entrepreneurship 5 years ago changed over the last 5 years with the introduction of ChatGPT, large language models.
Yeah.
And it seems like all the startups today are related to, they're trying to jump on the bandwagon before it's too late, right?
For sure. Yeah. And I'm part of my second AI startup. So
so you're part of it too, then.
Yeah. It's hard to convey to anyone who's not in the AI startup world, like how rapidly everything is changing.
Right.
But I think what everyone is starting to see is no matter where you're in the workplace, starting to see how rapidly the world's changing. Classes ended around the 10th of December. And that was I always have a little holiday break, project for myself. And mine was to really learn how to understand how to use LLM. ChatGPT had just come out. And so I started working with it right then. And I started
integrating into your classroom too, I'm assuming?
Almost immediately.
Yeah.
It was interesting because, let's see, it would have been November of 23. I did a presentation on AI. I did a research study over the summer. And what we did was I had a student who was in our STAR research program, and I literally had him sending emails and calling entrepreneurship centers, universities all over the country, asking the question, like, how are you using AI? And the answer was not a lot. And so, and at the same time, I was looking at all these AI tools that were emerging. And so I presented my findings at a conference called the Global Consortium of Entrepreneurship Centers.
Okay.
And there were 65 seats in the room I was in. 85 people signed up for it, and at least 25 more showed up.
Wow.
I mean, it was like nothing I've ever done. I'm giving this presentation in this room where literally people were packed in, sitting on the floor, like just everybody. And it was because it was the only session that was talking about AI.
Right.
And it was interesting because I went back to that conference a year later, and everybody was talking about
right.
AI. I started assigning like exercises in early 2023. Okay. So I mean, most students were getting hammered in every class. Like, if you even turn this on, you're cheating. You're gonna get thrown out of here. And I'd be like, okay, everybody, if you don't have one, open it up and like start an account for ChatGPT. And you could tell they're like. I just got out of a class and they said I'll get thrown out of here for this. And, I started using it to help them like figure out market sizing and how to start doing ideation and started really working with them on prompt engineering. So one of the things I did early on is I just started saying, listen, every assignment that I give, you may use ChatGPT unless I tell you not to. But here was the caveat. Just like if you're writing a research paper, you put in all these sources. Do the same thing. So tell me what you used, because even Claude was around at that point. I don't think like Perplexity or some of the others were there yet. A lot of students were using one called Cactus. Okay. That was the one that everybody's like, they're cheating, because it was kind of like, it's like, help you get your schoolwork done. So essentially, I'm like, use any AI tools you want. Right. The only thing is, I need you to cite what AI you used. And I asked them to copy in, or at the time you had to like screenshot. There wasn't a good way to copy your
the actual transcript.
Yeah, I'm like, I want to see how you interact with it.
Yeah.
And I recently I was in a discussion with someone, and we ended up co-authoring an article about it because I made the comment. I said, what I learned after several terms of students turning in work and showing me how they were using ChatGPT is, students are using AI like a magic 8-ball. Yeah. They'll put in a sentence or two and they'll shake it up and see what they get. And of course they get something like, it is decidedly so. Because it's like, they're not really giving any input.
Like garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I've always been kind of pushing the students to use it rather than telling them they can't. But I've just been giving them guardrails to, not just like, don't use it to shortcut your work.
Right.
Use it to do your work really well, because that's what startups do. And it's funny because I've even still find myself in debates, and I'm like, I don't know, I don't know if it's a professional in a different field. I'm like, I don't know how your field works. What I can tell you is, in my field, I'm a practicing entrepreneur in the IT tech space, in the AI space, and it's like, we're doing things faster every day because we're always testing and adopting and re-implementing AI tools into our process. Anybody who's not doing that is falling behind.
Yeah.
So it's like, if I teach them how to do entrepreneurship without AI, I'm teaching them to fail, and not fail in a good way. I'm always like, ready, set, fail is one of the courses I teach. Right. You want to test, you want to iterate, you want to experiment, you want to like learn through failure. Right. but like failing to use the tools that everyone else is using
Right.
and being slower because of it is like, that's just an avoidable failure.
Yeah.
And so I feel like we have an obligation to.
So
teach
you were
them.
one of the first adopters, obviously, at Drexel. If the other professors are, not using it, I'm just curious what you were doing in the classroom. Was it in violation of like the corporate AI policy at the time, or did they have one? And how's that policy changed? And now are all the professors basically doing what you're doing?
Yeah. Yeah. First of all, I would say there's been heavy adoption in the last year. And the school just in this past year is really, not only are they now encouraging it, they're actually, giving us tools to use, and they're encouraging it. And there's, they even have like an award that was out recently. And, so there's a lot of a push now for it. But early on it was a little dicey. So, there were definitely some slow adoptions and some cautious adoption and some cynics and skeptics and all those things. I mean, some universities just flat out came policies like you're not allowed to use it. I actually heard, one very, very large school that we all know really well, essentially for, and I think I'm not even sure if they've changed it, but like at least until recently, they were still like not allowed to use AI. And I don't know how, it's kind of like telling engineering students they're not allowed to use a TI-80X calculator, like it's, so. By
the way, I'm affiliated with a different university who, when the LLMs first came out, like you said, 3-4 years now, the initial reaction was just to say, hey, no, you just can't use it.
Yeah.
But that same university, a few years later, not only has adopted it, allowed it, they now provide a Google Gemini to every student.
Nice.
And they've asked every professor to actually integrate it into the curriculum. Basically, it's here to stay. And if it's here to stay, we got, and so I'm really proud of that particular institution for, going through the transformational journey, and it only took them a couple of years. So I think the initial reaction is to change, to progress, is always one of fear. And so, and I was just wondering if at Drexel that was that initial was, or because they have a school of entrepreneurship, were they like more open to it?
Yeah,
So.
I don't think it was because of us. I will say, I don't speak for the university for sure, but I would say there was an openness to let each instructor kind of decide how they wanted to do it, and there were guidelines, there were suggestions of like the language was provided, and so there was
allowing each professor to adopt them is in an ethical way.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's so the thing I've done in the past year, really starting with this past spring, so almost a year ago now, I went from allowing it to be used or having some exercises around it to, I had a whole assignment series in how to leverage AI tools in our field specifically. And so I would put them into situations that I had been in oftentimes the previous week and say, okay, like explore what AI tools could be used to address this. Yeah. This is where I taught a class called Entrepreneurship and New Technology, and I brought in one of the world's leading experts in cryptocurrency and AI, someone I'd worked with in industry for years. And he's a startup founder now and doing some things. And we were we built the class around what I would call the intersection between agentic AI and blockchain, which is like cryptocurrency. We all know what agentic AI is today. But 9 months ago, no one was talking about agentic AI. Everybody was still pretty enamored. Everybody was kind of like getting their head around LLM, large language models.
And just for those who might be listening, so we have our audience is made up of educators, but also mental and behavioral health workers, social workers, counselors. For those who are listening who might not know what agentic AI is, why don't you just define it for them?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of what ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini do is like they're really organizing words.
Right.
Let's say, we put a lot of words in, they organize it, they look for patterns, they compare it to words they have in a big giant database for, I'm oversimplifying it, but they're looking for patterns, and then they're able to bring those back together in things that, almost simulate human language.
Right.
But really at the end of the day, you're having a conversation with a piece of software and it's giving you a response. That's large language models. Agentic AI is when AI starts to do stuff.
Right.
And it starts to do stuff on your behalf. It can start to operate in the world on your behalf. I mean,
Right.
we're taking a step towards scary.
Right. They can start to do your job for you, which
Right.
begs the question, am I going to be replaceable?
Yeah.
Which is like what a lot of the fear, at least initially, was.
Yeah. I was pretty early on. I started using AI to help me with grading assignments, particularly like written assignments that were longer and those kinds of things. That was actually pretty controversial at the time. So I was cautious in the way I did it. And everybody's like, oh, that must have saved you so much time. It did not.
Right.
It took me more time. However, the feedback that I gave to students when I used AI to grade was more personalized and more robust than it ever could have been.
Yep.
And see, this is the part where I think AI is not going to be easier for us. It's going to be harder.
Yeah.
Because in the past, there was an expectation of what someone could reasonably get done. And there wasn't an expectation that, you'd go too far beyond that because, you don't expect so much of people.
Right.
Well, anyone who's been using AI consistently for the last 4 years,
right,
will tell you it's like you can 10x the amount of output that you have if you build AI, if you build and train AIs well and you use them effectively, you can probably do 10 times what you're doing before.
Right.
But it won't be long. And I'd say we're really close. Now that everybody gets it, like it's like that 10x is going to be the expectation. That's going to be the new table stakes.
Right.
And that's right in front of us.
Yeah.
And so, but it goes back to, I think, a more personalized experience, the way we serve our customers, I'll say for lack of a better term, those that we serve, we're going to be able to serve them better and more uniquely than ever before. And I talked about how Penny was so good at leading one person at a time. As workers in any field, we're going to be able to serve those core stakeholders one person at a time in ways we never could have before.
Yeah.
So I got, to this point where I'm like creating content. Well, AI really helped me when it got to the point where I'm like, I'm really going to consolidate my efforts onto a couple of channels and create content. I started to really rethink what content is. And what AI has done for me is I've been able to take years and years and years worth of writings and posts and videos and conversations and just pour this into AI so that it understands what it is I do. And it's become a thinking partner. It's helped me to develop a canon of content. What are my core messages? What are my core purposes? All these things. And really, train it in the way I write. And, now a lot of times, like the first draft I get will be better than I would produce in 2 or 3 rounds of drafts in the past because it already has, kind of incorporated not just my new idea that I've put in there, but it's also drawn from, not just what I was reading this last couple months. It's fresh in my mind, things that I talked about or wrote about or created, a year or a couple years ago. And so it's really helped me to rethink every class lecture, every email exchange, every podcast interview, every Zoom call. It's like, it's giving me more that I can use to train this model to help it understand what, the impact I want to have, the message I want to have, and I'm able to then direct it to be able to contextualize this.
Right.
And that's so, and I think, then bring it back to the classroom when I'm doing grading. It's like I'm able to bring that same kind of a thing where if my rubric has like 5 or 6 different areas, usually my comments are going to be, about, 1 or 2 things. I'm going to say one thing that was like, I'm really going to say you were right on target with this. Here's some things you can do to expand on it. Maybe one thing that's like, hey, this wasn't quite right. Here's some things you can address. Whereas now I'm able to say, I'm going to give you feedback in all 6 of these areas, much like what you said. Right. And now they're probably going to have their AI read it and summarize it for them at this point. But to me, it's like the AI has become like, instead of taking one pass at something and calling it done, the AI almost requires you to go back multiple passes over and over and over again. And so I think the language I'm seeing now is people talking about it being a thinking partner, and it very much is that.
Like a partner, collaborator. It's Yeah. I want to kind of finish where we started. You mentioned the $10 million question as you were talking about your story. I understand you got a book coming out. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's probably a little premature. I have a book in process.
You have a book idea.
Yeah, me and my AI rating assistant are working feverishly on, trying to capture this story. I recently did a post on LinkedIn. I literally held up a piece of paper at the beginning of the year, and it just said, mission for the Entrepreneurship. It's like to help 1,000 accidental entrepreneurs to launch, grow, and thrive by December 31st, 2030. So it's basically, this is a 5-year mission. I want to help 1,000 accidental entrepreneurs to launch, grow, and thrive. And what I mean by accidental entrepreneur is just someone who doesn't think of themselves as an entrepreneur. They've got an idea, like a passion, a skill, just a product in mind, something like that. They think they could make a go of it, or they maybe want to take what they're doing professionally for somebody else and do it for themselves, but they're just like, where do I start? That's an accidental entrepreneur.
Got it.
And, there's this whole journey that an entrepreneur goes on. Everyone sees these companies that are successful and that they're working and they're like, that we just know of, depend on, even like, and it doesn't have to be a big giant company like Amazon. It could be, the local, electrician or something like that, where they're like a construction company that's got, 50 employees. It's the journey of getting from, I think I could do this, to like, it's running to the point where the owner's not even necessary anymore.
Right.
And that space in between is really complicated.
Right.
It's like company, people go to work for a company that's been working and it's like, okay, I just do this job, and it's like simple. It's like somebody's figured all that out. And so that's really the target. And, that includes students who have gone to school to say, I want to become an entrepreneur and study entrepreneurship. Students that have gone to school because they're interested in, the fine arts, or they want to go to culinary school. They want to go to fashion school. They want to go to some kind of art school. They want to be an engineer. They want to, all these things. There's opportunity to create something that doesn't exist today, but it's a journey. And so that's, the first thing I would say is that's the mission. And really that $10 million question, that's, anytime I engage with someone, I ask that. And I started asking that question. I didn't really have a reason for it. But usually when I get someone answering that question, I start to hear what they really would like to do in life.
Right.
And a lot of times my challenge to them is, why do you need $10 million to do that? Very few people, and I said this before, have given an answer that requires $10 million.
Right.
I can think of one time I asked a young person very early in their career, I said, what would you do if you had $10 million? And they said, without pause. This was somebody in their like early mid-20s, like not without pause. I'd go down to Philadelphia. I'd buy one of those warehouse buildings that are just kind of abandoned. I would turn it into a 20-story or 12-story, whatever, this multi-story hydroponics like laboratory growing all kinds of vegetables, and I would use it to address food scarcity among the homeless population in the city. I was like, whoa, that's a vision.
And that'll cost $10 million.
And it'll probably cost $1 million, right? And so my challenge to him though was like, well, can you buy a 20-gallon aquarium and start experimenting with hydroponics? And is there an organization, like I think about like Evan Ellers and all he's been doing for the homeless community, like with Sharing Access. It's like in Philadelphia, it's like, is there someone you could you give $20 a month? Or could you go volunteer an hour a month? And so that's usually a lot of when I ask that question, whatever the answer is, my question will be, what are you doing right now?
Got it.
To move in that direction. If somebody says, I want to start a company, but I just, it's going to be a while. I'm going to have to figure some things out. I'm like, don't go to sleep tonight until you start the company.
Right. It's
this simple. Go into Google Drive, create a new folder, call it My New Company, put the year on it. You just started your company, start ideating, and this is where tools like AI can be so helpful because I use the dynamic voice on ChatGPT all the time. If I'm on like a long drive or something, I'll just kick that thing on and we'll just have a conversation for an hour or two. Yeah. Actually 70 minutes, it turns out, is where it kicks you out for the day.
Okay.
But I'll just say, hey, I think I want to start a new business. And I'll be like, oh, hey, great. What's the idea? Well, let's come up with some ideas.
Right.
Okay. What kind of problem do you want to solve? What kind of people do you want? So you kind of get this conversation started from the very simplest form.
Right.
And it can be as simple as like, hey, I've noticed this group of people has this problem. Let's come up with 10 ideas for what we might do with that. It's like, okay, a company is born because those 10 ideas are like, well, those are terrible. Those bad ideas can lead to better ideas. Or the one idea on that list that's like, okay, that's totally off the wall, but it makes me think of this other thing. Let's come up with new ideas like that.
Right.
And so this is where these are tools that can help us to, just explore what's possible and to experiment and test ideas in really simple, small ways without having to go to the big $10 million thing right out of the gate.
For someone who's 22 years old and has a passion and has a dream, regardless if it's starting a new company or not, what are 2 or 3 kind of nuggets of wisdom you'd share with that person?
Sure. Before I answer that, I want to ask you a question.
Sure.
Do you remember the year that Photoshop eliminated photography?
I don't.
Because it didn't.
Right. Trick question.
Trick question, right?
Right.
You know, it's like there's more photography now than there's ever been.
Right.
The tools that became available through digital photography, through Photoshop, through, imaging, 3D imaging, all those kinds of things. Photography has never been more prolific.
Right.
So for anyone that's in the arts or things, and I say this to people who have creative writing companies or people that are in public speaking or anything like that. It's like AI is not going to eliminate any of this.
Right.
It's going to change the tools.
Right.
There was a time when, illustration was chalk and it was paper, right?
Right.
Well, now there are just hundreds of thousands of tools that are available.
Right.
Some of them are AI oriented. I believe that the entrepreneurial mindset and the entrepreneurial competencies, and this is, again, biased opinion. That's like, this is maybe my hammer in search of a nail, but the mindset of not just creating, but creating in a way that has a specific impact on a specific group of people.
Yep.
And a money model that allows you to generate money from it. Even if not to be rich and famous or anything like that, but just enough to sustain what you're doing. That's what the entrepreneurial process is.
Right.
And I think, a lot of what we've been talking about with AI today is that's going to be the process that everyone's going to have to use. It's like there's not going to be this set place in the world. Like you train for 4 years and you go take a job doing this one thing and that becomes your life, right?
Right.
I think everyone's going to get a core set of skills, but one of the most important thing is to learn how to navigate chaos.
Right.
Learn how to navigate ambiguity, learn how to deal with uncertainty, but to do it in a way where it's like, okay, I have this unique set of skills that nobody else has.
Right.
And to be able to learn what it is that, the problems in the world that you can solve with that skill in a very unique way, and also a way that people will pay for it.
Right.
That's the money model.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
We just scratched the surface. We could go so much further than this. So I want to invite you back at some point,
of course,
a few months from now. Because there's so many ideas and thoughts and questions we didn't even get to explore. But our time is up, and I'm so thankful for your time. So thank you, John.
Thanks so much for having me, GT. This was awesome.
TLC Connections is supported in part by the Lincoln Center for Family and Youth. Through education, counseling, coaching, and consulting, we empower people to make positive choices, meaningful connections, and transformational change. To learn more, visit thelincolncenter.com.